This is Art Sense, a podcast focused on educating and informing listeners about the past, present, and future of art. I'm Craig Gould. On today's episode, I speak with Pace Gallery CEO Marc Glimcher about the gallery's current Picasso exhibit, which honors the artist on the 50th anniversary of his passing. The exhibit, titled Picasso, 14 Sketchbooks, is just that. 14 sketchbooks that provide unrivaled insights into the development of iconic Picasso artworks over a period of nearly 60 years. And now, inside the working process and creative mind of Pablo Picasso, with Pace Gallery's Marc Glimcher. Thank you so much for joining me today on the Art Sense podcast. Marc, you are the president and CEO of Pace Gallery, and Pace is currently exhibiting a new exhibit of Picasso works, Picasso 14 Sketchbooks. I say it's a new exhibit, but the work is not new, right? In this exhibit, it's on view at Pace's New York gallery now through December 22nd, and it marks the 50th anniversary of the artist's death. And I think from my research, this is kind of a personal subject for you because Picasso died in 73. The estate was settled in 79. And in 1985, a very young Marc Glimcher has his first project with the family business, along with a buddy named Matthew Marks. Can you kind of take us back to that project and how things are different here as we sit these decades later?
Thank you very much for welcoming me on my favorite podcast. I'm actually just the CEO. They fired me from president recently. Samantha Rubel's job now. Let's see. Yes, that is a long time ago. Matthew and I shared a desk at the old Pace Gallery at 32 East 57th Street. Matthew actually got me my job. My father, when I told him I wanted to come work in the family business, just hung up the phone on me. Had to call Matthew to convince him that I was not going to be a complete screw up.
He had seen your grades at Harvard.
Yeah, not pretty. Not pretty. But Matthew and I had gone to Dalton together. He went all the way through. I started in third grade, so we knew each other a long time. So we had an amazing experience. My father, as you said, had come to the Picasso family back in 79, 80, and had made a proposal like everyone did, because that was really when the estate was settled. It took 6 years, 6.5 years for the estate to get settled. And there were lots of ideas of cubism shows, et cetera, et cetera. But my father had this idea for a show of the sketchbooks. He actually didn't start there. He started with a show of the late paintings, which was the first show of the late paintings since Picasso showed them at the Palais du Pape. And that started off our relationship with the Picasso family. And I was in high school then. That was 1981. So I guess that's probably around the time I met Bernard. And anyway, then college goes by, and after that, we came to work, and my father said, "All right, boys, sending you guys to Paris." And we went to Claude Picasso's office on the Rive Gauche, and we each got a banker's box. The fake wood paper banker's box, cardboard banker's box. Right. And Claude was like, "Okay, take notes." And we each got one, and the sketchbooks had been sealed up by the French government, and they were all in there, and we just went through one by one, and it was without a question my very young life the most dramatic experience I'd ever had, seeing this sort of secret life of Picasso just revealed before your eyes as we went page by page. Anyway, that exhibition, which had been my father's brainchild and Matthew and mine, toil along with Claude and the whole family was it was incredible. It was something that we actually got American Express to travel that show. It went to 21 museums in 17 countries. So we were a road show for the next 3 years, installing those sketchbooks all over the world. And it was an incredible revelation at the time. All these years later, I think you asked what's different. All these years later, people don't quite realize that back in the 80s, Picasso was still, of course, Picasso, most famous artist in the world. Picasso is an icon and had been for decades and decades. But it was a little different in 1986. There were no $100 million Picassos or anything like that. I mean, in fact, a Matisse was about 3-4 times more valuable than a Picasso back then. And Picasso, it was still an idea of inquiry into trying to understand the history of Picasso for a lot of people. Today, Picasso has reached a different level of icon status, a kind of icon level that defeats a subtle understanding. Not intentionally, but that's the result. Everyone thinks they know everything, that somebody knows everything there is to know about Picasso. And the kind of the way one thinks about an icon like that is you don't really think about it. It just has this compartment in your head. Oh, Picasso. Mm-hmm. It's an idea, not a person. And so I hope that this exhibition will bring back that understanding that this was a guy, who went on an investigation and kind of fomented revolution and rethought everything, broke every rule. And somehow looking at those sketchbooks, you're right next to him doing that. So he becomes so humanized in that exhibition that I think just walking around up there, people really can see it in a new way.
It's really interesting because I talk to a lot of artists that you represent, and one of the things that I feel is really consistent, and I think it's probably tied to your credo there, is this notion of extended, restless, continuous inquiry. And when we look in these sketchbooks, we don't see someone who is necessarily trying to feed the dogs dog food. I mean, he's continuing to kind of challenge himself for one reason or another. I mean, who knows what his motivation is?
You're right. It's like an athlete. If you watch a great athlete, in their life, it is this relentless pursuit. The sharpening of the sword goes on every single day. And this was the mobile laboratory for that pursuit. That mastery of line, which seems like magic, it doesn't seem like magic in these books. It seems like you said, the relentless pursuit of the mastery over that line. Again, scratch it out when it doesn't work. I mean, those scratch outs are really, we opened some of the books to those scratch outs, so they would be visible. And I mean, I appreciate, take that as a great compliment that our artists and our gallery are kind of we are engaged in that pursuit. Our family is like half art, half science. We have my brother is the chairman of neuroscience at NYU. My cousin is the chairman of the head of Dana-Farber. And we have all of our family on the art side, but we always we kind of grew up with that scientific, not in the sense of the pursuit of science, but in the kind of relentlessness of the scientist's quest to pose questions, investigate reality. And that was those were the artists that we grew up with. Just sadly lost Robert Irwin, who was, such an incredible researcher. Dubuffet, who we would, listen to in the studio. Agnes Martin, Louise Nevelson, and they were not engaged in a career. They were engaged in a lifelong assault on the the gates behind which truth was lying.
It's kind of at the core of your family, because all those names at one time or another would have been around your dinner table when you were a kid, right?
Yeah, we were very lucky. I mean, that's just and look, this is what drives the artist. All artists who are successful become somewhat distracted by their career. It becomes this validation of everything that they've done, and then it's a kind of a burden as well. Mm-hmm. And there's no escaping that conundrum. That is part of art and part of the history of art. That's all okay. All the contradictions are okay. But it is incredible to watch them go through it. They have everything on the line every day. And that would have been a good title, actually, for this show, Putting Everything on the Line. And note to self, next show.
Well, in another 28 years, we'll revisit the sketchbooks.
Yes. But you can see it with Picasso. You can see what he's engaged with here. It's there's this one little sketchbook in the show with a little self-portrait in it, and it's very powerful self-portrait, and it gazes back at you like a mirror, and the book opens vertically, almost like a makeup mirror, and he's staring at you, and of course he's staring back at himself. And it's powerful. It's interesting because I don't think it's not really the Picasso of 1918 in there. It definitely looks more like the Picasso of 1911 or 1912. It's him as a young man in his most, revolutionary phase. He's drawn him as he had been, 7 or 8 years earlier. He'd become, this incredibly successful man, with Olga, his fabulous ballerina wife. He was in Biarritz. It was a very bougie Picasso. But the Picasso on that page is the young, hungry Picasso, and you can just, you can feel it. You can feel it in that show.
So I guess I wasn't familiar with Picasso the poet. And so one of the sketchbooks, and I believe it's the last of the lot, has an amazing bit of poetry in it. And it's, and it really struck me as not someone who's kind of holding on to these classical ideals of pentameter, but it's really stream of consciousness, cut up text, something that would come from a William S. Burroughs or
100%, 100%. Yeah, I was going to say it's a total piece of beatnik poetry. It's the 50s, by the way, and so it's the late 50s. So Picasso is in his 70s, and he is writing this beatnik poetry. Picasso did say once, "I hope one day I'll be thought of as a poet who occasionally dabbled in painting." He really thought of himself that way. And again, this is all what this show is about, is revealing the Picasso you thought you knew, and you're really trying to deepen that understanding for people.
There's another sketchbook that was a real surprise to me. It was the Jean Lapin sketchbooks from 1924. Mm-hmm. There is this work in there that he referred to as constellations that looked nothing like I associated with Picasso. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I remember opening the sketchbook back in '86 and seeing these things. They looked a lot more like Calder than like Picasso. And they were featured in the Picasso Calder shows that went on the last couple of years. They were actually the end paper. We used them for the end papers of our first book. They were so shocking. As you really pore over them, they seem to be, they're really a schematic of a Cubist painting. They're almost like the bones you would hang, as the scholars refer to them, the wedges and hinges that make up the facets that make up a Cubist painting. You would almost hang them on that structure. And in fact, the constellations morph into guitars and violins as you leaf through that book, and the sketch become more familiar. But yeah, he was so much. 1924, that was a very radical thought to engage in that kind of investigation. It was also really about the ink and the pen. He left blank pages between these compositions, so the bleed through it didn't bleed through, but he was worried about it. So he would do a page, then leave a blank page, and then do the next. And it's interesting because Picasso's known for his mistakes, right? He loves his, go over the line again and again and again. There's no mistakes on these pages. There are no mistakes. There is no hesitation. Every line is flawless and straight until the wiggly versions at the end, but they are like they were plotted out by an architect. Guy could do anything. It was amazing. And he really had a plan there, because he bought that sketchbook in Paris, right, at Saint Allier, which is still there, the art supply store, on the Quai Voltaire, if I am not mistaken. And he brought it to Jean Lapin. And it's a very fancy sketchbook, very expensive sketchbook. So he had a plan. And then at the end of that sketchbook, those ink lines turn into these portraits. They're just like, again, it's not like anything you've ever seen. Crazy scratching line that turns into this unbelievably beautiful portrait of the neoclassical of Olga, really, of the kind of neoclassical subject. Pretty amazing.
So these 14 sketchbooks, when you and Matthew showed up in the 80s to unseal these bankers boxes, help walk me through what happened in those years after, because last year I had the Jean-Michel Basquiat estate on to talk about the King Pleasure exhibit they were doing.
Yes.
And part of that story is nobody anticipated him dying. He rented his loft. They came in, boxed it all up, and stuck it in storage,
Right.
and it just lived there for decades. Was it the same sort of thing where when Picasso died, somebody was in charge of boxing it all, and all of these sketchbooks wound up in one place? And what's the number? Because I've heard as many as like 200 sketchbooks in total.
There's 175 is a number, 202 is a number. I don't have the final number, but it's something like that. Just to your Basquiat story, we were involved in that show. That was a phenomenal show, and his sisters are amazing stewards of that legacy. And yeah, when we first opened that show, that was when they first opened that show. It was we had people walking through that saying, "I just never understood Basquiat before. I just never saw it. This is the way an art exhibition should be." Like heard that so much, and it was incredibly designed, and of course there was that spot in there where you walked through his old studio, millions of dollars drawings scattered on the floor of the Starrett-Lay building, and it changes the way you're able to think about the artist. But Picasso's estate was, it became a very complex, dramatic, story that eventually, the French government became extremely involved, and there was a cataloging done of everything that was in his possession. Things, although there were many family members, and of course there was a widow at the time. Mm-hmm. Despite that, eventually, through a very complex process, absolutely everything got cataloged. And the Picasso family agreed with the government to an incredible, as they say, dachshund, which is the donation of a portion of the holdings of the artist in lieu of taxes.
Right.
And it was incredibly generous on the part of all the family members. They could have fought, and we would not have the Picasso Museum that we have now. That is the result of that gift. But as a result, everything had to be accounted for. I mean, he was an incredibly wealthy man by the end of his life, and had, of course, properties and all sorts of assets and so much art that he had kept. But you can see when you look on find a Picasso painting without a signature. Okay, those are all the Picassos he kept. All the drawings and the paintings that he didn't sign. He signed them right before he gave them to his dealer to sell. And you look through these sketchbooks and you see the cataloging mark in pencil. They're in the sketchbooks, they're on the backs of the paintings, they're on the backs of drawings. So meticulous. There's a little number with a decimal point, a little number after that. Very mysterious code. But everything was amazingly accounted for and tallied up and divided. And, there was, people don't remember the story now, but, at the time, there was a law that illegitimate children would receive nothing.
Mm-hmm.
The Senate in France changed that law. They didn't change it entirely. They made it so that illegitimate children would receive half shares.
Wow.
Interestingly enough. So Claude and Paloma, received a half share. And the government did the divvy up between grandchildren, children, and of course his widow. And it's kind of remarkable that they completed it by 1979, but it took that long. So yeah, they all had numbers sealed in plastic envelopes, and amazing.
The messiness of his relationships, a lot of these relationships were very open-ended, which is just, and I wonder how accepted that was in its day. I don't know, but a lot of these figures wind up finding their way into the sketchbooks, right? We see Dora Maar, we see Jacqueline.
Yeah.
And so it's interesting to see these women kind of walk in and out of these sketchbooks over these, 50, 60 years, right?
Absolutely. I mean, this, of course, is another major topic when you're thinking about a Picasso exhibition, is kind of the replacement of the story of Picasso's work by the story of Picasso's life. And a lot of indictment, a lot of controversy about his relationships, which undoubtedly there was. Obviously people did see it very differently then than we think about it now. But I think it's amazing to watch, the people in his life were the subject of the work. There are many artists for whom that is not true. The owl was his owl. The bull were the bulls that he saw at the bull ring. This is very appropriate for someone who had a sketchbook in their pocket all the time. Mm-hmm. Like, his subject was his life, war, peace. And if your subject is your life, you better have a sketchbook handy so you don't miss it. He always did. And I think that, whatever the judgment is on Picasso's relationships and whatever that is, he sure caught it. He caught the what we see in the Royan sketchbook in 1940 is Dora Maar. And Dora Maar, who was a great political activist, as was Picasso at the time, becomes a kind of foil for the war. They're in the town of Royan, which is where they've gone to get out of Paris. And the agony of war gets painted all over, Dora Maar's face. And people talk about the agony of that relationship at some point in the mid 40s, but really in 1940, it is really about the circumstance that they're in. I don't think people appreciate that Picasso refused to leave France. Sidebar here, sorry, but since the history of it's all tied up, there's so much not told in the story. People don't realize that Picasso, who was on the Nazis' list as a degenerate and as an agitator, Picasso made this very risky determination that they couldn't touch him, and stayed. He went to Royan, but then he went back to Paris. And there were a few times when he just narrowly escaped getting shipped off, but he wouldn't leave. He would not leave France. We have a little glimpse into that in that Royan sketchbook. But I do think back to the icon thing, that like that status, the status of his reassessment of his treatment of the people in relationships with him and so forth. This can't get us to throw out the accomplishment of Picasso. It is very natural for succeeding generations to say, wait a minute, that's not the story. We're going to retell this story. This story was, you were sold a bill of goods on this story. By the way, that's exactly what Picasso said. In 1907, Picasso and Braque were looking at single point perspective and saying, you guys are sold a bill of goods. This thing is not the be all and end all of art making. Mm-hmm. Break this thing into little pieces and start over. So Picasso was absolutely for, decimation of the status quo. But I think it's really important, and if this show helps at all, that as we reassess our canon, as everybody says, which needs so much reassessing, that doesn't include throwing out the accomplishments of Picasso. Okay? There were a couple of years there where every artist in the world was a cubist. That's never happened. That has never happened. Nothing like that has happened in the history of art.
Right.
Where, and this is true, you could see it in Korea and in India and in America and South America. I mean, the ricochet of that idea that those guys had in that little dump in the Bateau Lavoir and, Montmartre, my God. I mean, it's mind-boggling, the impact of that. And no internet, no nothing, magazines and, for no movies, really. I mean, there were movies going on. The movies were very important to Picasso, but they weren't like moving around the world. The newsreels had not happened yet. And somehow, how did Cubism go and conquer planet Earth? I don't know. So we're still living there, still living in that world. Right. So anyway, I think reassessment and reappraisal is so important, and I think he thought that too. But don't throw out the genius with the bathwater.
Right.
That's my advice.
So how did you and your team decide on these 14 sketchbooks? I mean, are these kind of touchstones over the career? Obviously, some of these show, for example, the Demoiselle sketchbook, Oh
my God. Yeah, that's nuts.
Right.
The answer to that, this is amazing. The answer to that is back to my relationship with Bernard, who is, like I said, we started working together when I was 21 and he was 24, something like that. And we were really responsible citizens, model citizens. That's sarcasm, in case you want to know. Anyway, the two of us have seen a lot together, and we both grew up into this. It really became a vocation for both of us. I was very, very lucky to grow up around artists, but I'm just as lucky, and probably my closest friends are, Bernard Picasso and Christopher Rothko and Sandy Rower, and watching these guys promote, protect, and enshrine their grandfather's or father's legacy, has been, I've been very, very fortunate to be a small part of that with these guys. They have done an incredible job. So anyway, Bernard and Almeen created Faba, and Almeen Rack, Bernard's wife, is a brilliant art dealer, gallerist, and they created the museum in Malaga with Bernard's mother. They've just done such incredible work. So when we thought to do this, everybody, all the family members are making so many loans this year. They are working so hard. Every family member, there is a as you know, there's a wonderful exhibition over at the Gagosian Gallery right now, which is absolutely spectacular. A fascinating subject, brilliantly executed. Everybody's making loans. It's a very tough year to call up a member of the Picasso family and say, "Hey, I got a show idea." So it was easier, and it was expedient, and it was for me very meaningful to call Bernard and say, "Hey, Bernard, let's you and me do this together." So these are all Bernard's sketchbooks that are not currently on loan.
Oh, wow.
So that's how we picked. We felt there was one big hole in, which was there was no Cubist sketchbook. Mm-hmm. So we did borrow one sketchbook from the Met, of course, from the Lauder, which has been also incredibly, helpful, and we've had incredible scholars working on this show as well, by the way. But the Lauder Center is always amazingly supportive. So that's where the sketchbooks come from. That's what Bernard had to lend us, but it pretty much hit almost everything. Had that one little hole, and it has a little hole at the end. It's missing the late 60s, mm-hmm. for which we were able to borrow a painting as a kind of capstone for the show, just because that was the one period that didn't really get covered in the sketchbook. Although the last sketchbook from 59 definitely does show the beginning of the late work. So that's the story of that.
Well, Marc, one thing I'd love to wrap up on is, obviously with the long history of Pace going back to 1960 in Boston, you work so closely with the estates of Rothko, Tapias, Calder. You also have a commitment to, the next phase. What is technology? I mean, your investment in Pace Verso is something that just continually intrigues me in conversations with people like Tyler Hobbs. How do you balance keeping one foot in the past and one foot in the future and one foot in the present? I mean, is that a necessary part of it? The fact that you need to have a foot in each of these generations to have a healthy organization?
I don't think you need to. I think you can have a fantastic gallery that is devoted to a single group of artists, maybe a single period, or maybe that's, the group of artists that's just, these are my friends and my taste. And I think that's great. I just think that, we're very fortunate here. We've accomplished the handoff from one generation to another and still maintained the relevance and the relationships with the artists. We have artists in their 20s and 30s and 40s and 50s and 60s and 70s and 80s. And sadly, our nonagenarian artist just passed away, but we did have, we don't have any teenagers. But my father, I think, did a strange thing. In his 20s, he started working with the pop artists. They're the people he went to school with, Roy Lichtenstein, Andy. They were very good friends of his. They were all the same age. But in the 20s, he went and he really sought out, Louise Nevelson. He made relationships, in his 20s to get himself in front of Jean Dubuffet, mm-hmm. who was perverse enough to leave the Pierre Matisse gallery to come to the gallery, a 28-year-old guy. He somehow got himself to the Venice Biennale, helping Giacometti install, the Femme de Venise. He got himself everywhere. He would be like, "Where's Dad?" And he was like, my mother would be like, "He's across the street at Mark Rothko's studio, quietly sitting in a corner watching him paint." There was a pan-generational, universal pursuit. The pursuit was futuristic in the 14th century. The pursuit was futuristic in the 20th century. It's always about the future. Mm-hmm. So if it's always about the unknown future, the thing that you can't see yet, then if we ossify that into some segment of people who said, look, James Turrell and Bob Irwin, they saw, you know, phenomenological, experiential art here. We're just going to look at that. We're not going to look at what it's transmuted into today. I mean, that is no fun. I mean, we learned those lessons to try and see something, not just to benefit from it or be branded by it. Oh, you're the Light and Space Gallery, So why be the Light and Space Gallery if you're not looking for the artists who learned those lessons and are trying to now, implicate them in the next generation? There's a risk here, and I hear it all the time. The risk is, oh God, you're all over the place, Mark. It's not that I'm all over the place. It's that I am not risk averse. Okay? Because the artists, as you said, sitting around my dinner table as a kid, were not risk averse. Mm-hmm. And I want to see, either you're trained to be like a connoisseur, great, and be like, this is good, this is bad, this is great, 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 this is not so sure. Or you're trained to think the way the artists think, which is that there's something out there. How did Dubuffet say it to me? He said, as soon as they tell you it isn't art, pay attention to it. And yeah, that makes for a program that has a bit of a wandering eye to it, but I would not have it any other way.
Well, Marc, again, I really value your time. Thank you for taking us by the hand through this exhibit that covers such a huge portion of Picasso's life and gives us insight behind the scenes. And thank you for giving us some story time about Pace. And so I appreciate your time, and I encourage people to go out and see Picasso 14 Sketchbooks on view now through December 22nd at Pace's New York Gallery.
Thank you so much.
That's all the time we have for this week. You've been listening to ArtSense. You can find the show on Apple Podcasts, iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher Radio, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. If you've enjoyed this podcast, be sure to subscribe. And while you're there, please rate the show and leave a quick review. Your feedback is the key to other folks finding us. And if you'd like to see images related to the conversation, read the transcript, and find other bonus features, you can go to Cambia.art and click on the podcast tab. If you'd like to reach out to me, you can email me at craig@cambia.art. Thanks for listening.